Joseph Fouch seems to have been the one man the emperor genuinely feared, and with reason. The J. Edgar Hoover of his day, the atrocious chief of police, had files on everyone, and at a moment's notice could send a legion of Bonaparte skeletons rattling out of the cupboard. Napoleon therefore ducked the task of tackling him head-on and went for the softer option, Talleyrand. On the 28th of January 1809 he summoned his lame chamberlain, kept him standing for 3 hours, and tore into him with rare ferocity. The burden of his invective was that Talleyrand was an ingrate and money-lover who, in return for the wealth of Croesus lavished on him by the emperor, had repaid him with bad advice. The Dingian fiasco was mentioned, and treachery. Doubtless remembering Mirabeau's famous quip about Talleyrand, the Abb of Perigord would sell his soul for money, and he would be right, for he would be exchanging dung for gold. Napoleon cast at him a famous insult: "You are nothing but shit in silk stockings." Talleyrand made no reply but a bow. Then, when the 3-hour tirade finally blew itself out, went straight to the Austrian embassy and sold his services again for 1,000,000 francs to the new ambassador, Clemens Metternich. This inflation proved equivalent of 30 pieces of silver seems on the generous side, for Talleyrand was sacked as Grand Chamberlain next day and was thus cast out of the inner circles. Besides, all that Talleyrand could tell him Metternich knew already. There was discontent in France in elite circles. Well, certainly, why else was Talleyrand in the Austrian embassy? The Austrians had already taken this factor into account when making their decision for a war of revenge. 4 principal considerations encouraged them to think that this time they could beat Napoleon. In the first place, the French would be reluctant to engage with them, for they were already fully stretched in Spain and their crack units were in the peninsula. Secondly, Tsar Alexander had hinted strongly that, Erfurt or no Erfurt, he would not back Napoleon. When the French suggested a joint remonstrance to Austria, backed by the threat of a Russian declaration of war, Alexander declined to have anything to do with it. Thirdly, the Austrians knew, even before Talleyrand confirmed it, that France was war-weary and the necessary moral commitment for a major war was lacking. This in turn connected with the final consideration that there was a new spirit of nationalism abroad in Germany and in Austria. After Jena, Prussian intellectuals like Fichte, Arndt and Schlegel began campaigning for a unified Germany as the way to defeat Napoleon. Within the government, reformers like Friedrich Stein had the upper hand for 2 years. They emancipated the serfs, founded universities, shook up the old bureaucracies, and, most ominously, reformed the army with a unified ministry of war and a commission for military organization, which oversaw a new Landwehr militia and its Trojan horse, the Krumper system of short-service training. Stein eventually proved the truth of the proposition that the key to Napoleon's imperial power was his alliance with Europe's old elites. The landowning Junkers, fearing that they were the eventual target of Napoleon's reforms, divulged the scope of his ambitions to the French. Napoleon's reaction was swift. From Spain he imposed a new convention on the Prussians, including an order to exile Stein. He backed this with an imperial edict declaring Stein to be an enemy of France and the Confederation of the Rhine. Although the Prussian middle classes had originally welcomed the French Revolution, the trauma of Jena turned them into a curious hybrid: liberal reformers at home, rabid Francophobes in foreign affairs. Over and over again the soul-searching Prussians asked the same questions. How was it that in late R806 large, well-provisioned garrisons surrendered to Napoleon without firing a shot? Why did German monarchs have no pride? William II of Prussia had emerged as a cowardly nonentity. The King of Saxony was a self-abasing French puppet whose palace at Dresden Napoleon used as a hotel, while the Emperor Francis was a pathetic figure who spent his time making toffee or endlessly stamping blank sheets of parchment with specimens from his huge collection of seals. Something of this German Risorgimento spirit was also evident in Austria. Despite a precarious financial base and Emperor Francis's dislike of anything that smacked of Jacobinism, Archduke Charles, appointed supreme commander-in-chief with powers superior to those of the Aulic Council, managed to reform the army. Charles's methods involved wholesale imitation of Napoleon's, the Army Corps system, employment of sharpshooters and skirmishers, rigorous drilling, improved artillery and supply infrastructure. By early I-809 the Austrian commanders were itching for war. The cautious Emperor Francis was doubtful. To the war party, who argued that England would help with troops and subsidies, and there was a good chance that Prussia and Russia would be drawn in, the emperor answered that Tsar Alexander had made it plain he would not go beyond neutrality. As for England, she would consult her own interests. As ever, the emperor and his advisors had tried to drive a hard bargain with the British over subsidies for fighting Napoleon, but, in financial terms, they had gone a bridge too far. London curtly refused the extravagant Austrian demand for a down payment of PSC's million to cover mobilization and a further £5 million for each year her armies fought. Emperor Francis was finally bounced into war in February I-809 when it was put to him that any further delay might enable Napoleon's continental blockade to work, in which case there would be no English subsidies. As a result of the Austrian declaration of war, Napoleon faced his most difficult military task since the Marengo campaign. The Austrian army was far better than in 80 seconds, but his own grand army was far worse. Behind him was an insurgent Spain and a British presence in Portugal. Ahead of him was an armed and restless Germany, and his home base was moody, uncertain and treacherous Paris, with men like Fouch and Talleyrand waiting in the wings. However, he was not entirely unprepared. At the back of his mind he had long been expecting this blow to fall and, in anticipation, had conscripted the necessary manpower to deal with the threat. In I-808 a senatus consultum called up 80,000 more conscripts from the classes of I-806, I-807, I-808 and I-809, and in December I-808 a further 80,000 from the class of I-8IO were called up 2 years in advance. The unexpected losses in Spain meant that a further U0 of the class of I-8IO were called up in the new year of I-809. The original Austrian plan was for a surprise attack on the Rhine, hoping to spark a rebellion in the Confederation of the Rhine which would suck Prussia into the conflict. But Archduke Charles finally reverted to a more traditional strategy. There would be a three-pronged attack, with the main army punching through Bavaria, Archduke John invading Italy and Archduke Ferdinand taking out the Grand Duchy of Warsaw in the rear. The tripartite assault was the first Austrian mistake. The second was the assumption that Napoleon lacked the manpower to fight on all these fronts and continue campaigning in Spain. Perhaps Bonaparte encouraged the false optimism by an unreal, almost narrow stance in early I-80 grams. On February Roederer recorded a conversation with the emperor in which he stated, "I have only one passion, only one mistress, France. I sleep with her, she never lets me down, she pours out her blood and treasure, if I'll need S00000 men, she gives them to me." This was boastful self-delusion. His original aim was to have 260,000 troops in Germany, and IS-0000 in Italy by the time war broke out. In fact, he managed a combined total of 275,000 in the two theaters. Already about a tenth of all conscripted Frenchmen deserted and hid in the mountains. In any case, about half the Grand Army was non-French, being composed of Belgians, Italians, Dutch, Germans and special mixed units resembling the later French Foreign Legion. In Napoleon's army of I-809 could be found Swiss, Polish, Croat, Albanian, Greek, Portuguese, Spanish, Lithuanian, Dutch, Irish and even Negro units. Pace Clausewitz, this was no longer a citizen army or a levy en masse, but a professional army with interests distinct from those of the French nation or even the class from which it was mostly recruited. Once it was possible for conscripted citizens to purchase substitutes, the Grand Army filled up with the dregs of society, and became more like a traditional flotsam and jetsam host of the ancient regime type. Had Napoleon read his Machiavelli carefully, he might have spotted the danger. The one clear element of continuity with the past was the Guard, most of which was withdrawn from Spain in the spring of I-80 grams. Napoleon made 3 bad errors at the beginning of the I-80 grams campaign. He assumed that the Austrians would send large forces to Italy, and make their main effort there, as in past wars. He appointed Berthier commander-in-chief, with Devout, Messina and Oudenot immediately below him, and himself remained in Paris. This curious decision is usually interpreted as a desire to extract maximum propaganda advantage, when the Austrian blow fell, by presenting it to the French people as a wholly unexpected sneak attack. Berthier, though, proved a disastrous choice as field commander and could not even keep abreast of the flow of orders from the emperor. But Napoleon's worst mistake once again revealed his military Achilles heel, failure to take the weather into account. Having campaigned on the Danube in autumn and winter, he was wholly unprepared for the weather-driven physical aspects of the battles he would face there in spring and summer. On the 9th of April the Austrians began their invasion of Bavaria, without a formal declaration of war and 6 days earlier than Napoleon expected. At first Archduke Charles and his 20,000-strong army carried all before them. Through Berthier's incompetence the French forces were hopelessly split, and disaster loomed. It was fortunate for Napoleon that heavy rain and inadequate supplies held the Austrians up, so that he was able to speed to the front and take personal charge. Leaving Paris at 4 a.m. on the 13th of April, and accompanied by Josephine as far as Strasbourg, he arrived at Donauworth on the 17th and at once realized that the price for concentrating his army would have to be the abandonment of Ratisbon. He then spent 5 days of continuous fighting, trying to regain the initiative. He began his counterstroke by ordering Devout to make a fighting withdrawal from Regensburg, and Ingolstadt, drawing the Austrians after him while Messina and Oudenot struck east round the enemy left flank and cut communications to Vienna and the Danube. The battles of Thann, Ebensburg, Landshut, Eckmühl and Ratisbon saw Archduke Charles repulsed and his army badly mauled, but Napoleon was scarcely at his best at the climactic battle of Ebensburg-Eckmühl on the 22nd of April, where the Austrians brought Devout to bay. After much vacillation, he finally decided to attack Charles there with his entire army instead of trying to encircle him. He therefore diverted Messina from his outflanking movement, and commanded him and lands to attack the Austrian left before Charles could overwhelm Devout with superior numbers. Ekmiel was a hamlet on the river Robber, containing a huge Baroque watermill. Napoleon ordered a frontal attack across the Robber water meadows, which eventually forced the enemy to retreat. But nightfall and general weariness in the ranks meant that the French did not pursue their foe to Ratisbon, and, on advancing there next day, Napoleon found it grimly defended by Charles's rearguard. It was during the unsuccessful attempt to force this position that Napoleon sustained his one and only battle wound, being struck on the right foot by a spent cannonball. Eventually Lanz's division was able to take Ratisbon, but not before Archduke Charles made good his escape. Although Charles retreated from Bavaria to Bohemia, Napoleon had hardly covered himself with laurels. The two decisions, to attack frontally instead of attempting encirclement, and not to press the pursuit from Ekmiel, were both contrary to his own military canons. The chance of a quick knockout blow, as in Rieti O, Rieti S or R806, was gone. Some have even precisely pinpointed Ekmiel as marking the decline of Napoleon as a great captain. Certainly he made a number of miscalculations and unwarranted assumptions, and was so far from his usual form that one is tempted to adduce psychological reasons. It is known that Napoleon took one of his casual one-night stand mistresses during this campaign, which was not his usual practice. His defenders, however, claim that sending Messina on a sweep of the Saale on the Zoth was his real error, that his tactical handling of a week of battles was inspired, and that the road to Vienna lay open, a not negligible achievement for a commander whose best units were in Spain. Most of all, Charles's 30,000 casualties and precipitate retreat removed all temptation from Saxony, Bavaria and Württemberg to throw off the yoke of the Confederation of the Rhine in the name of German nationalism. Uncertain exactly where Charles had gone, but guessing somewhere between Vienna and Moravia, Napoleon advanced cautiously along the right bank of the Danube, uncomfortably aware that the enemy had broken down all the bridges across a river in full springtime spate. Learning finally that Charles was in Bohemia, the emperor opted not to follow him there but to aim for Vienna and try to secure a negotiated peace. Yet time was not on his side. The Austrian corps under General Hiller fought several rearguard actions to delay the French advance on Vienna, to give the city time to prepare its defense adequately. Napoleon found himself held up not just by stubborn fights at Wels and Ebersberg, but by the crossing of several flooded Danube tributaries. To make matters worse, news now came in that his viceroy Eugene de Beauharnais had been defeated in Italy. Vienna surrendered on the 13th of May under threat of bombardment, but the garrison withdrew to the north bank and destroyed all 4 bridges across the Danube. Napoleon entered the Austrian capital to an icy and sullen welcome. The problem of the Danube bridges obsessed him, as he wrote, to cross a river like the Danube in the presence of an enemy that knows the ground and has the sympathy of the inhabitants is one of the most difficult military operations conceivable. Additionally, he was outnumbered. On the 16th of May, Archduke Charles joined forces with Hiller, giving him a total strength of US 0 against Napoleon's 8Z 0. Moreover, French forces were scattered, for Devout with 35,000 men was 40 miles west of Vienna, putting down local uprisings, while Lefebvre's 7 Corps was at Salzburg. The problem remained how to strike fast at Charles, given that he was on the north bank and the Danube was engorged with heavy spring floods. Napoleon now made another mistake. He decided to cross the Danube at Alborn, 6 miles south of Vienna, where islands split the river into 3 streams. He intended using Lobau Island, 2/3 of the way across, a lush, uninhabited place full of enormous poplar trees, as a jumping-off point, but he had not taken into account the difficulties of building bridges in these conditions, lashed by torrential rains and assailed by Austrian commando raids, sometimes even having to endure violent storms and the attacks of fireships. French engineers and pioneers took a week to build a pontoon across the 825-yard stretch from the right bank to Lobau, using 68 pontoons and 9 rafts. The first French units reached the island on the 20th of May and, after completion of the much shorter bridge across the 3rd channel to the left bank, Massina's and Lanz's corps crossed north to the mainland and established a bridgehead at the villages of Aspern and Essling. By 2 May, Napoleon had 25,000 men on the large open plain KNDWN as the Marchfeld, an arid and desolate spot on the north bank of the Danube. Timing his attack brilliantly, Archduke Charles then attacked with a huge army of I-0 men and 250 guns. He quickly drove the French out of the villages of Aspern and Essling and back to the bridge. Once again, it turned out, Napoleon had miscalculated. He had not known that Charles was within striking distance on the bridgehead on the left bank and assumed he would be able to reinforce Lanz and Messina easily. But now the news came in that the bridge from the left bank to Lobau had been breached, first by rising water and then by Austrian fireships and battering rams. By now the Austrians had perfected a technique of floating huge hulks and logs downriver which smashed into the pontoons. On the north bank an increasingly serious battle developed around Aspern. In the nick of time Napoleon got enough men across the repaired bridge to fight the Austrians to stalemate. But the French position remained grave, for Charles could easily get reinforcements and they could not. On the 2I-3I-0 French troops had to confront more than I-0 Austrians with 260 big guns at their disposal. On the 22nd, after makeshift repairs to the pontoons, Napoleon managed to ferry more men over. Now he had S-0000 infantry, I-2000 cavalry and I-44 guns to face the Austrian host. Ferocious street fighting went on in Aspern and Essling on the morning of the 22nd, and then Napoleon ordered a strong attack on the Austrian center. At first Lannes seemed to carry all before him, but he was eventually forced to retreat by his own shortage of ammunition as much as an Austrian counterattack. In any case, Napoleon could not get Davout's corps across the river for the coup de grace, as the bridge had broken once again. The hand-to-hand fighting of that morning in Aspern and Essling was repeated in the evening darkness. In one of these desperate encounters perished General Saint-Hilaire, on the point of receiving his marshal's baton. After murderous close combat General Rapp and the Young Guard managed to retake Essling, but then came news that the bridge to Lobau was broken once again and the Emperor had ordered a general retreat to the island. In almost the last fighting on the mainland, Marshal Lannes had both legs smashed by a cannonball. His limbs were amputated but gangrene set in and he did not recover, lingering in feverish agony for 8 days before succumbing on the 31st of May. Predictably, Bonapartist propaganda elevated his death into a glorious death for France, and the Emperor apotheoses. The French withdrew to the island of Lobau, cut the bridge linking the mainland from its moorings and drew it back onto the island. Heavily outnumbered, Napoleon had been defeated, a fact his propaganda machine worked hard to conceal. But Austrian propaganda was just as mendacious. 25 French generals and Napoleon himself were said to have perished in a Cannae-style debacle. Despite heroic deeds by Lannes, the Grand Army had been worsted and the fault was the Emperor's. He made 2 bad mistakes, giving battle without knowing Charles's numbers, and failing to assemble his entire army on Lobau first. The Austrians sustained 23,340 casualties, the French probably in the region of 22,000. Napoleon, naturally, lied and claimed his casualty figures were 4,000. At Aspern Essling the Emperor lost his reputation for invincibility. For 36 hours after the battle he remained in an indecisive brown study, apparently stupefied by the setback. Fortunately, perhaps, the Austrians made no attempt, either then or later, to take Lobau. It was almost as though they could not believe their luck in having beaten the Corsican ogre. By the 24th of May Napoleon was himself again and next day the bridge from Lobau to the south bank was reopened, allowing the French finally to evacuate their wounded, who had lain in the open for 48 hours. Napoleon was aware that he faced one of the great crises of his life, for unless he retrieved his reputation with a great victory Germany would rise behind him. It has to be conceded that Bonaparte recovered well from the initial paralysis after Aspern Essling, for the gloomy news he received while on Lobau would have been enough to demolish a lesser man. Following the initial French setbacks in Italy, a serious insurrection broke out in the Tyrol, headed by the charismatic figure Andreas Hofer. There had been serious military stirrings in Germany, prompted by the new spirit of nationalism. In Westphalia Major Schill was attempting guerrilla warfare while in Saxony the Duke of Brunswick's son and his Hussars of Death were on the rampage. This so-called Black Legion cut a swath through the cities of Dresden, Leipzig, Brunswick, Hanover and Bremen. In Paris there were rumors of popular discontent, and plots, and hard news of a fall on the stock market. In Spain the military advantage the emperor had secured a few months earlier was thrown away by the incompetence of his marshals, principally Soult, who remained inactive after capturing Oporto in March R809, apparently in the quixotic belief that he might be proclaimed King of Portugal. His idleness and inactivity, and his jealousy of Ney, enabled the British to land large-scale forces under Wellesley in Portugal in April R809. Displaying nerves of steel, Napoleon ordered up reinforcements from Spain. Convinced that the Austrians would not attempt a landing in strength on Lobau, but simply keep up a token bombardment from the north bank, he evacuated all the army except Massena's corps, then turned the island into a fortress bristling with guns, 100 of them trained on Charles's army. Then he painstakingly built proper bridges across the Danube, which would be invulnerable to anything but actual Austrian occupation. Isolated on Lobau for a month, by the end of June he had constructed 5 more bridges across the Danube, 3 of them to Lobau, and built stockades, pile-driven into the river bed upstream, to block the passage of fireships or floating logs and hulks. Additionally, he stationed a fleet of naval gunboats on the river. Fortune favored the brave. On the 14th of June, Eugene Beauharnais and General MacDonald with the army of Italy defeated Archduke John at Robb, then sent word they were on their way to the relief of Lobau. With their 23,000 men and the corps under Devout and Marmont he had also summoned, Napoleon had 60,000 men and 500 guns by the beginning of July. Amazingly, the Austrians remained inactive in face of this build-up, waiting for the general German uprising which never came. On the 4th of July the emperor was ready to strike. He began by throwing across 3 bridges from Lobau to Aspern-Essling, encouraging Archduke Charles to believe that he would be attempting his maneuver of 6 weeks earlier. His real objective with this feint was to put his army on Charles's left flank so as to get between him and the Second Austrian Army under John, which had retreated into Hungary after Robb but was now closing in again. He therefore landed an advance guard at Gross-in-Zerdorf, from which his engineers constructed 7 pontoons to Lobau. He assembled his troops at the northern crossings to Aspern-Essling with great din and hubbub, then switched them at the last minute to the 7 bridges east to Gross-in-Zerdorf. On the night of 5th of July the French streamed across the Danube on the 7 eastward pontoons, beset by torrential rain, yet buoyed up by the emperor's inspired tactics. His plan was indeed a brilliant one, requiring split-second timing and coordination. Amazingly, the diversionary feint and the actual crossing went off without a hitch. Not a single man was lost, and complete surprise was achieved when the French emerged at their new location on the north bank. But Charles was saved by his own lack of imagination. Hoping to repeat his success on the 22nd of May, he pulled his troops back to lure the French into Aspern-Essling instead of opposing the imagined crossing, as Napoleon had expected. The consequence was that the French outflanking movement was no longer feasible. But the Austrians were in a rare panic when they realized the true state of affairs and pulled their troops out of Aspern and Essling on the double. By 9 a.m. on the 5th of July the 3 front-line corps of Devout, Oudenot and Messina were moving forward to make way for the second line and the 3rd Marmont's corps, Bessieres' cavalry and the guard. The general advance was sounded at noon. Everyone knew there would soon be a battle, for on the treeless plains of the Marchfeld there were now nearly 300,000 men and 900 cannon. The Austrians had 36,000 troops and 400 guns, Napoleon 56,000 and 500 guns. Charles drew up his army in a semicircle of 15 miles running from Aspern through the villages of Aderklaa and Markgraf Neusiedl with his center resting on Wagram. Napoleon placed the bulk of his army, Devout, Oudenot, Eugene and Bernadotte on the right, leaving Messina with just 27,000 on the left. In reserve he kept 0 guard and 8,000 cavalry. The dispositions were classically Napoleonic, aiming for the center position or hinge between the 2 wings of the enemy army, and arranged so that he could transfer troops from one flank to the other faster than his opponent. But it was not a textbook formation, since Napoleon had no choice but to fight with his back to the Danube. The emperor had 3 aims: to pierce the Austrian center before it was reinforced, to gain a decisive victory so that Charles could not escape, and to split the enemy before Archduke John could come to the rescue. It was with John in mind that Napoleon ordered the attack at 5 p.m. on the 5th, despite the lateness of the hour. The first part of the Battle of Wagram was a near fiasco. Oudenot's corps withdrew after taking heavy losses, while Eugene's army of Italy panicked and fled, having earlier mistaken the Saxons for the enemy and fired on them. They were forced to turn and face the enemy only when they nearly impaled themselves on the bayonets of the guard in reserve. Both Devout and Bernadotte failed to make progress. The emperor was forced to call off the attack and spend his 3rd successive night without sleep. Once again Bernadotte had failed at a crucial battle, but this time he went too far. Attempting one of his gasconades to conceal his failure to take the village of Aderklaa, he declared that Napoleon had botched things and that if he, Bernadotte, were in command he could have forced Charles to surrender without firing a single shot. He followed this up by abandoning his position outside Aderklaa at 4 a.m. on the 6th, pleading the necessity of shortening his line by linking with Eugene on the right and Messina on the left. This was reported to Napoleon, who finally snapped after a decade of ingratitude and treachery from the Gascon. Furiously countermanding Bernadotte's movements, he ordered him and Messina to take the village regardless of casualties. Bernadotte then committed the error of galloping right into the emperor's path. Napoleon raged at him. "Is this the type of telling maneuver with which you will force Archduke Charles to lay down his arms?" he thundered. Seeing Bernadotte lost for words, he continued, "I hereby remove you from command of the corps which you have handled so consistently badly. Leave my presence immediately, and quit the Grand Army within 24 hours. But the contumacious Gascon had not finished. Before he left for Paris he issued a bulletin, praising his men for their part in the battle and claiming they had stood like bronze. The only thing brazen about Bernadotte's corps was its marshal's effrontery. Napoleon was obliged to publish an official rebuke, stating that Bernadotte's order of the day was contrary to truth, policy, and national honor. On the morning of the 6th, Napoleon tried again. His tactics were for Messina to hold while Davout and Oudenot made a frontal attack. The army of Italy would be held back for the moment of breakthrough, but Charles upset the emperor's plans by attacking first, aiming for a double envelopment of the French. With the anvil of his operations at Wagram, he sent his right wing to seize Aspern and cut Napoleon off from the Danube in that sector, while his left threw the French right back against the river. 2 Austrian corps accordingly attacked Messina, hoping to roll him up and seize the Danube bridges in the rear. Things seemed to be going the Austrians' way. On their right they were forcing the French back to Aspern, while in the center they were forcing the Saxons to give ground, fearing that Messina's corps was on the point of buckling under the onslaught, and therefore that a gap might open up, enabling Charles to use the center position against him. Napoleon ordered Messina to disengage and shift to the left. This involved marching Messina south across the front of the enemy lines, screened by cavalry. To take the pressure off, the emperor ordered the cavalry reserve to charge and Davout to press his attack with even greater vigor. MacDonald and the cavalry performed brilliantly but took heavy losses. To some extent these were offset by the accuracy of the massed French artillery on Lobau, which, finding a perfect target in Charles's would-be enveloping forces, mowed them down in droves. Next, Napoleon filled the gap vacated by Messina with massed artillery. 100 cannon opened up on the Austrians at close range. For a while the battle settled down to slugging, bloody attrition, with Oudenot's men directing artillery fire on the Austrian center at Wagram but not yet engaging it. By midday Messina succeeded in reaching his new position, and was poised for counterattack. The plan was that he would switch flanks at the decisive moment to aid Davout. Meanwhile, a titanic struggle between Davout's corps and the Austrian left was finally resolved in favor of the French, but not before Davout's first line was broken. Shortly after midday Napoleon saw through his spyglass that Davout's firing line was passing the church tower at Markgrafneusiedl, the prearranged signal that Davout had turned the Austrian left, and was about to curve towards Wagram from the rear. It was time to move up the army of Italy under MacDonald and Eugene. Following a heavy 60-gun bombardment, the emperor launched Oudenot, Messina and the army of Italy under MacDonald against Wagram and the enemy's center. MacDonald deployed 30,000 men in a gigantic hollow square, 6 ranks deep, with other infantry in column on either flank and 6,000 cavalry in the rear. Austrian cannonballs devastated the square, but it still came on. MacDonald's force finally dug in at a sandpit, and under this cover reinforcements were brought up. By now Napoleon had spotted a weakness on the Austrian left center caused by having to reinforce their left against Davout. He ordered Davout to strike at this hinge while Messina attacked the enemy right. But the Austrians continued to fight like dervishes, and MacDonald's attack again seemed to be petering out when Napoleon finally broke the deadlock by committing all his reserves except 2 regiments of the Old Guard. This was a crucial decision. Finally the Austrians broke, and by 2 p.m. the French were advancing confidently on both sectors. Learning that his own reinforcements would not arrive until nightfall, shortly after 2:30 Charles was forced to order a general retreat to Bohemia. Napoleon's forces were too exhausted to pursue him. The Austrians had been beaten but by no means routed, and withdrew in good order, leaving no guns or standards behind. This was no Austerlitz or Jena. Having fought 6 hours non-stop, the French were at the limits of endurance and could not be prodded to follow the enemy. In any case, Napoleon still feared that Archduke John might arrive, in which case a third day's fighting was likely. Wagram was Napoleon's last great victory on the battlefield, but it had been a close-run thing, and, had Archduke John appeared at the moment the emperor committed his last reserves, a signal defeat would have followed. As it was, a greatly improved Austrian army had fought a below-par French army almost to a standstill, to the point where Napoleon lacked cavalry for pursuit operations. The Grand Army had fired 7-0 rounds in a murderous, bludgeoning battle that seemed to usher in a new era of slaughterous warfare, and anticipated the bloodletting of the American Civil War. French casualties were 32,000, Austrian 35,000. Napoleon, following his usual practice, toured the battlefield to inspect the piles of dead and wounded. After further skirmishing at Zinum on July, the Austrians suddenly threw in the towel and asked for an armistice, which was arranged on the I-2nd. Francis I at first refused to honor it but reluctantly ratified it on July 7. A dispute between Francis I and Archduke Charles led the latter to resign and retire into private life. A tense 3 months of negotiations and bargaining ensued, with the likelihood of renewed hostilities ever present. There were 2 main reasons for this. One was Napoleon's demand for the abdication of Francis I. The other was that Austria stalled, hoping that the military intervention of the British could save them from harsh peace terms. The British had made some attempt to assist their ally. When Austria invaded Bavaria in April, Britain sent a subsidy of £250,000 and a further £337,000 a little later. By the time of Wagram, subsidies to Austria amounted to psi 8 seconds 0, even as London also committed substantial sums to the struggle in Spain. In April, Admiral Gambier led a Royal Navy attack on the French Rochefort squadron. His deputy, Admiral Thomas Cochrane, used fireships to burn 3 French ships of the line, made 3 more unfit for service, and destroyed 2 frigates. The rest of the French squadron lay aground, waiting to be finished off, but Gambier refused to take his battleships into the roads, to the fury of Cochrane and other observers, including Captain Frederick Marryat. As Napoleon justly remarked, if Cochrane had been supported, he would have taken every one of our ships. But the great British enterprise of I-809 was an attack on Walcheren Island on the 30th of July, supposedly the opening of a second front to aid Austria. But in attacking Walcheren in the Scheldt, the British were primarily consulting their own interests and pursuing their old obsession about Belgium. Thoughts of the possible benefit to Austria came a long way down the list. The operation was feasible only because Napoleon had sent most of his troops eastwards, so that it was a case of Austria helping England, not vice versa. In any event, the landing on Walcheren quickly turned to debacle, though it was a protracted one, since the British did not leave the island until the 23rd of December, hoping the Austrians would resume hostilities. Bad weather, inadequate planning, and incompetent leadership vitiated the expedition. The British took so long to take Flushing that the French were able to rush reinforcements to the ultimate target, Antwerp. Disease finished off the enterprise. 4,000 troops died and I-90 were hospitalized. The British incursion at Walcheren enabled the dauntless Bernadotte to make a temporary comeback. Put in command of the troops at Antwerp, waiting for the British thrust that never came, Bernadotte issued an order of the day boasting that his IS-0 men could hold the city against all comers. When this order was brought to him, Napoleon was enraged. He pointed out that there were 60,000 troops at Walcheren, not IS-0, and that, whatever the numbers, it was simple professional incompetence for Bernadotte to reveal them to the enemy. He sent an order relieving the contumacious Gascon of command. I intend no longer to leave the command in the hands of the Prince of Pontcorvo, who now as before is in league with the Paris intriguers, and who is in every respect a man in whom I can no longer place confidence. This is the first occasion on which a general has been known to betray his position by an excess of vanity. Meanwhile, the Austrians dragged out the peace negotiations, hoping for a great British success or for intervention from the Tsar, now widely known no longer to see eye to eye with Napoleon. The Russians, however, warned that they were not yet ready for a rupture with France. In Poland, after an initial victory by Archduke Ferdinand, the brilliance of Prince Poniatowski soon undid all the Austrian gains. The one possible bright spot for Austria was the Tyrol, where heavy fighting had been in progress since April. There had been 2 major campaigns, and twice Napoleon's Bavarian allies had been thrown out of the region by the Tyrolese liberators, most recently on I-3 August. Napoleon decided that he could not return to Paris until he had a definite peace treaty with Austria, so in the summer of I-809 he ruled the empire from Schönbrunn in the Austrian countryside. Here he resumed his affair with Marie Waleska, but it was no longer the grand passion of 2 years earlier, as the tone of his letter of invitation to her partly indicates. Marie, I have read your letter with the pleasure your memory always inspires in me. Yes, come to Vienna. I would like to give you further proof of the tender friendship I feel for you. The imperial valet Constance diaries show Napoleon and Marie spending every afternoon together, but Napoleon's attentions cannot have been fully engaged for. When he went to Vienna in August to consult the physician Professor Lanefranc about his indifferent health, he conducted a brief liaison with the 19-year-old Viennese Eva Kraus, who was said to have borne him a son. What is certain is that in September his regular mistress Marie Waleska announced that she was pregnant. Once it was demonstrated that the emperor could indeed sire children, it was evident to all well-informed observers that Josephine's days were numbered. Finally, in October, the Austrians accepted that they could stall no longer and signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn on the 14th of October. Napoleon imposed harsh conditions to assuage the shock of the 1809 crisis. Francis I was forced to cede Carinthia, Carniola and most of Croatia, including Fiume, Stria and Trieste. Bavaria was given Salzburg and the upper valley of the Inn, while the Grand Duchy of Warsaw got northern Galicia, Krakow and Lublin. Tsar Alexander, who had played a double game throughout, ended up with eastern Galicia. Additionally, Austria had to pay a war indemnity of 85 millions, and agreed to abide by the continental system, limit its army to 1,000 men, and recognize Joseph as King of Spain. The humiliation to Austrian national pride found expression in a manifestation of the dark side of Austrian nationalism. At a military parade at Schönbrunn, 2 days before the signing of the treaty, a young Saxon student, Frederick Staps, tried to assassinate Napoleon while ostensibly presenting a petition. It was only a chance movement by General Rapp that diverted the would-be assassin's dagger. Napoleon was convinced Staps was mentally deranged, possibly from a childhood under the aegis of his father, a stern Lutheran minister, but Staps refused to accept this chance of a reprieve and insisted that his action was rational. Is a crime nothing to you, then? Napoleon asked him. To kill you is not a crime, it's a duty, Staps replied defiantly. He was executed a few days later and met his end exclaiming, "Long live Germany! Death to the tyrant!" Ever a man to turn any event, however untoward, to his advantage, Napoleon told Marie Waleska he was concerned at the possible shock to her unborn child and suggested she return to Poland. He himself left for Paris 2 days after the treaty, on the 16th of October, but he was shaken by the Staps incident and was convinced that if he had lost at Wagram, Germany would have flamed into rebellion. As he wrote to Rapp, who had intercepted the knife thrust, "This is the result of the secret societies which infest Germany. This is the effect of fine principles and the light of reason. They make young men assassins. But what can be done? A sect cannot be destroyed by cannonballs." Once again he had escaped from a tight spot. Once the Austrians capitulated, the steam went out of the Tyrolean rising. On the 25th of October the Bavarians occupied Innsbruck for the third time, this time signaling the collapse of the Tyrolean rebels. It took some time before Andreas Hofer could be tracked down, so that he was not executed until the 20th of February 1810. Napoleon's way with this martyr was as brisk as with Staps. There is a cold ruthlessness about the order he sent to Eugene Beauharnais, now back in Italy as viceroy. "My son, I had commanded you to send Hofer to Paris, but since you have him in Mantua, give instant orders that a military commission be set up to try him on the spot. See that this takes place within 24 hours. On his journey back to Fontainebleau, where he arrived on the 26th of October, Napoleon had time to ponder the lessons of the 1809 campaign. He had shown himself resilient under pressure, especially when he had to correct Berthier's mistakes, and he had displayed tactical flair at Wagram. On the other hand, his blunders were many. He should not have appointed Berthier in the first place. He offended against his own military principles during the fighting on the 25th of April and even more afterwards, perhaps especially by pressing on to the symbolic goal of Vienna instead of seeking out and destroying the enemy on the north bank of the Danube. His famous opportunism descended into mere folly in May when he attempted a quixotic, an unprepared crossing of the Danube, and, all in all, the emperor seemed to lack his old elan and brilliance. There were fits of lethargy and depression and vaguely worded orders. There is even some evidence that he had begun to lose confidence in his military abilities, for he wrote after Wagram, "Battle should only be offered when there is no other turn of fortune to be hoped for, as from its nature the fate of a battle is always dubious." Just as worrying was the declining caliber of the army, especially the Allied contingents, the flight of the Saxons on the first day of Wagram did not bode well. There was a worryingly high level of officer casualties, and indiscipline in the ranks was so bad that Napoleon was forced to institute 5 courts-martial. The one bright spot, the removal of Bonaparte, was the distinguished showing of the marshals. MacDonald, Marmont and Oudinot all won their batons for their exploits in the toughest campaign so far. Oudinot, whose contribution at Wagram was decisive, received a further annual income of 60,000 francs, and the dukedom of Reggio, which itself carried an annual endowment of 36,000 francs. But if Austria was pacified, there still remained the Spanish ulcer.